So I was browsing random content on YouTube when my eyes glanced upon an Iceberg video. Naturally, this made me want to watch a Frieren Iceberg video, only for me to discover that it didn't exist. In fact, I couldn't even find a Frieren Iceberg template picture. I figured this presented a great opportunity for me to insert my agenda. I decided specifically to make this a mysteries iceberg because it's what I know best. I should also note that not every entry on this iceberg is necessarily some deep mystery, but if I thought it was interesting and somewhat mysterious, I tried to include it. For the most part, this iceberg video will be very detailed and very long, nor will this be a regurgitation of random facts, but will include my own theories and some thoughts from the community. In short, this ain't no baby list.
All of you are babies!
There will be some mysteries that I've already talked about in previous videos, so I've included timestamps within the video if you want to skip them. Of course, there are going to be massive spoilers for the manga incoming, so consider this my heads up. Also, if I'm forgetting a mystery you like, please let me know in the comments. So without further ado, here is my ultimate Frieren Mysteries iceberg. Tier 1. Frieren Mischievous Smiling Tier. Alright, let's start off strong with the multifaceted mystery of who was the goddess of creation, and does she even exist? This is a surprisingly deep mystery with many different facets, some of which will be covered deeper into the iceberg. As you all probably know, the goddess of creation is a religious figure that is worshipped in the world of Frieren by the majority of humanity. Not much is known about the goddess herself, other than the idea that she last showed herself to humanity within the Mythical Era. If you look at the depictions of the goddess, you will see that she has elven features. Some in the community theorize that the goddess was simply a powerful elf from the past, while others believe she is an actual goddess that created everything. The answer to this is left ambiguous within the actual story itself. I actually go into this mystery in much more detail within a past video if you want to check it out. Personally, I believe that it's not that the goddess looks like the elves, but that the elves look like the goddess. I believe they look like her because they were either directly descended from her or were the first race created by her. I don't think it's too unreasonable to assume this, as it's a common trope within fantasy starting from Tolkien that the first race were elves, followed by humans later. We do also see other tropes from Tolkien appear within Frieren, such as the irredeemability of the demons, being analogous to the irredeemability of the orcs within the Lord of the Rings. Also, the trope of the elves fading over time is also present within the world of Frieren. Frieren herself remains skeptical concerning the existence of the goddess, as well as the idea of souls, essentially claiming that there is no evidence of the existence of a soul. Personally, I believe the goddess does exist because of a multitude of factors. The first reason would be the existence of the goddess's magic, some of which is so powerful they can even break the natural laws of magic that have been established within the world, which we'll talk about later. It would also render the whole point of Frieren's journey to Aureole pointless, as there would be no afterlife with which to see him again. The final reason I'll include is that if the goddess did not exist, then it would render the lives and beliefs of Heiter and Kraft as pointless. Like Heiter says to Frieren, I believe in the goddess because it's simply better that way. Who was the Demon King? At first glance, this seems like a basic question, but similar to the previous entry, it gets complicated real quick, so I'm going to keep this one brief. In short, the Demon King was the ruler of demonkind for over 1,000 years, and waged war with humanity before he was defeated within his castle in the north by the hero party. Despite being such an important figure within the story, very little is known about this individual. So little in fact that there is only a single panel within the entire manga that even shows the smallest glimpse of the Demon King. The anime doesn't even show him at all. Despite this, we have received little bits and pieces of information concerning the Demon King as the story has continued, many of which we will talk about in their own sections within the iceberg. The Scales of Obedience. There are a few questions that arise from this object that are not entirely clear, one of which relates to its origins. Initially, I had believed this object was some kind of ancient artifact, But this is unlikely to be the case when you examine Aura the Guillotine's magic, Austerlitz, a little closer. We know from Frieren that Aura has had these scales for over 80 years when the hero party last fought her, so it was not an item that she suddenly obtained. Additionally, we know that all the Sages of Destruction have magic that is powerful and is unique to themselves, else the Demon King would not have chosen them as his sages. We also know that demons spend their whole lives mastering their own unique magic. It doesn't make sense for Aura to base her magic off some pre-existing artifact that any other demon with mana could have used. If I had to take a gander, the Scales of Obedience is either a created manifestation of Aura's, or it's just a normal scale she picked up at some point. Either way, it's not that the scales are special, but it is Aura's Auserlitz, her spell of obedience that is unique to her, that makes it special. Interestingly, we don't see the scales again in the manga, which implies it dissolved with her when she died. However, the anime shows the Scales of Obedience on the ground long after she had passed, implying that it's a regular object she picked up along the way. Another question that arises concerning the scales is the mention of comparing souls. Frieren herself previously states that no evidence of a soul has ever been found, which makes the comparing souls expression questionable to begin with. Looking at the original Japanese source material, we can see that the word used is tamashi, which can translate to life force or inner essence, which better explains the expression. In other words, it's highly unlikely that it's referring to a literal soul here. How old is ... This next entry is referring to the ages of all the mysterious characters within the series, the most prominent being that of the elves and the Demon King. We already know that Frieren herself is over 1,000 years old. Of course, we don't know exactly how old she is, but it's unlikely she herself knows the answer to this question. This means that she was born after the Mythical Era had already ended, very likely sometime toward the end of the Unified Empire era, which we will talk about more further down the list. Another character's age that is widely speculated about would be Kraft the monk. Kraft is known to have gone on his own adventure with a priest long before the hero party went on theirs. Strangely, when Fern states that Frieren was from the party of heroes, Kraft does not sound impressed at all, even though the hero party defeated the Demon King, who basically caused the guaranteed extinction of his own elven race. I speculate why further down in the Iceberg, but for this entry just know that it probably means that he has experienced so much in his life that the defeat of the Demon King is just not that impressive to him. He even directly states that Frieren is young. I personally suspect Kraft to have been born sometime toward the latter end of the Mythical Era, at a minimum of 1500 years ago and a maximum of 2000 years ago. I should note that Kraft's journey with the priest would have occurred after the Mythical Era, as the priest we see is holding the scriptures which are said to have been given to humanity by the goddess 1500 years ago. Serie is the oldest known character within the series. All that is known about her age is that she is comfortably from the Mythical Era. We know this because she directly states it herself. It's impossible to say exactly when she was born. However, I think the closest answer we are going to get would be by examining how much mana she has. We already know from Frieren that a person's maximum mana is dependent on how long they have been training, so perhaps we can compare Serie's mana with Frieren's to try to get a baseline of her age. Unfortunately, we don't ever see Serie release her full output of mana, as she is constantly containing it, similar to Frieren, although she claimed that this strategy was useless and uses it anyway because she is a tsundere.
どこでも行く気かよ。実家に帰るのよ、バカ！バカ！バカ！
Luckily for us, we actually see a direct mana comparison between two characters that I believe will help us. When Heiter first meets Frieren, we get a direct visualization of their mana and a direct comparison, as Heiter claims his mana is 5 times greater than Frieren's. I'm going to go out on a limb and make a bunch of assumptions that are probably wrong, so hear me out for a second.
Let him cook! Let him cook now! Let him cook! I said let him cook!
Specifically, I'm going to compare the pixel widths of both Frieren and Heiter's mana to make a proportion that we can use to compare Frieren's base mana versus her max mana output that she uses later against Aura the Guillotine. This assumes, of course, that the width of a person's mana aura that surrounds them is linear to the mana they possess, which is probably not the case. It likely would be volume-based and experience cubic scaling instead of linear scaling. Normally, I would just use volume and utilize a cylinder or a cone to calculate total mana, but we don't have the total mana height values in the manga because the panels are cut off, and the mana would taper off toward the top anyway, which would complicate things even more. We also don't know how dense the mana would be, so I'll just use a proportion based on its width for simplicity. I decided to use the base of the character's neck as the starting point, however the endpoint is also very arbitrary, as most of the character's mana fluctuates vertically. I decided to eyeball the midpoint of the mana fluctuations to use as the endpoint of the measurement, but gave Frieren a bit extra. Using this comparison, we get the following equation. 507 pixels over 153 pixels gives us a 3.31 ratio corresponds with 5 times more mana. So every 3.31 pixel width ratio corresponds with 5 times the mana. Now comparing Frieren's base form with her max mana output in her battle with Aura using the same methodology, we get the following equation. 3256 pixels over 353 pixels, which gives us a 9.22 ratio. If we divide this ratio by the original and multiply by 5, we get 13.93 times the mana. This would mean that Frieren's max mana output is approximately 14 times greater than her base form mana, provided that mana width is linearly proportional with total mana. Remember, if we use mana volume instead of linear proportion, then Frieren's total mana would be much larger than her base form regular output. So we are extremely lowballing this number. Also note that Frieren's base mana is different when you compare the version of her that met Heiter and the one who met Aura. I suspect this is because she got much stronger after her journey with the hero party due to all the challenges she faced, not to mention the time that had passed. Now let's compare Seria's mana with Frieren's and make the assumption that she is holding back her mana proportionally the same as Frieren is. There are a few ways to go about this. One way is to compare Seria's mana using the same base width method, and the other is to take Lernen at his word. Lernen claims that Frieren's total mana is slightly less than Seria's base output. So let's do both methods and compare the results. If what Lernen says is true, and we use our previous calculation and assume that Serie is just as effective at holding back her mana as Frieren, then we can deduce that Serie is holding back her mana by a multiple of 14 times. So her true mana output would be 14 times larger than what she is displaying in this image. So what does this mean? Well, if Frieren took 1,000 years to get as strong as she is, and Serie is potentially 14 times stronger than Frieren, if we assume their rate of growth was the same, then it would have taken Serie approximately 14,000 years to get as strong as she is. Of course, this is assuming that Serie is as efficient at concealing her mana as Frieren is, which I'm immensely skeptical of. Interestingly, Lernen is able to see through Frieren's concealment of her mana, but does not mention Seria's concealment. I suspect this is not because Seria's concealment is better than Frieren's, but that he chose not to reveal his knowledge to Serie, perhaps because he is simply being humble and did not wish to insult Seria's hard work and efforts toward mastering mana concealment. Additionally, we must remember that Serie directly said that Frieren should be stronger than what she is for her age, specifically saying that her techniques are not very polished for a mage of her age. Whether this means that her mana should be greater as well is unclear. If we take this leap of faith and conclude that Frieren gained mana at a slower rate than Serie did, let us assume she did so between a range of 50% slower to 20% slower. We can take the 14,000 years, multiply it by these percentages, and get a range between 7,000 to 11,200 years old for the age of Serie. Something that should be considered is that we observe Serie conceal even more of her mana in a later scene, which implies this isn't the max concealment she is capable of. This combined with the assumption that Serie isn't as efficient at hiding her mana as Frieren makes me want to decrease the multiplier from 14 to 10 times. If we do this, then the range would decrease to between 5,000 to 8,000 years old, which is still an insane amount of time, but is still a little more reasonable. Trying the pixel width method, I decided to use Serie when she encountered Frieren, as she was displaying much less mana, meaning she was concealing much more. The image also lines up conveniently, which allows for the easy scaling of size. In this form, Serie has a base mana pixel width of 971 pixels, while Frieren has 353 pixels. If we do the math, this gives us a ratio of 2.75 between Serie and Frieren's base mana forms. If we divide this ratio by the 3.31 we got earlier and multiply by 5 times the mana we get from the Heiter multiplier, we get the number 4.16 times the mana. This means that Serie's base form contains 4.16 times the mana that Frieren's base form uses. If we take this number and multiply by 1,000 years, we get the final age of 4,160 years old. If we again assume Frieren gained mana slower at between 50 to 20% slower than Serie, this gives us a range of 2,080 to 3,328 years old, which is actually pretty close to what I initially suspected. Of course, this is all arbitrary and just for fun.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Well, that took forever. Anyway, the last individual concerning age would be the Demon King himself. We already know that the Demon King is older than Frieren, as her village was destroyed under his orders when she was a child. Not only this, but it is directly stated by Heiter that the Demon King reigned for over 1,000 years. We also know that the decline of the Unified Empire's era, which was when humanity ruled the continent under the Empire, was caused by the Demon King. As far as I know, this is not directly stated, but is heavily implied when Frieren states that humanity was reduced to 1/3 of its population by the Demon King during their heyday. Remember that humanity was getting its butt whooped.
You ever tried beating his ass?
What was the bell? You must have lost your goddamn mind!
By the demons, until Flamma was able to convince the Empire to start using magic. Further evidence that supports this would be the fact that the modern version of that empire is significantly smaller than what it was during the Unified Empire's era, which aligns with the idea that humanity's heyday was the Unified Era. Alright, I have mentioned all these eras and dates, so how is it relevant to the Demon King's age? Considering all that I've mentioned, we know that at a minimum, the Demon King would have to have been born in the early Unified Era, approximately 1400 to 1500 years ago, because he is the one who caused humanity's decline in this era. I can think of 2 potential explanations for the Demon King's age that I shall call the Old Age Theory and the Prodigy Theory. The Old Age explanation is the idea that for the Demon King to have been powerful enough to assemble basically all of demonkind under his command, he must have been much older than 14 to 1500 years. Otherwise, he would have been only a few hundred years old by the time he became king, which is a borderline toddler by greater demon standards. All of which implies he was potentially from the Mythical Era and slowly got stronger until he was strong enough to be called the Demon King by the end of the Unified Empire era. My other explanation, the Prodigy Theory, is the idea that if the Demon King was the strongest demon, then he was very likely a genius and/or a prodigy. We already know from Lugner that geniuses are able to bypass the slow strength increase from the accumulation of knowledge. In other words, they are able to get very strong very quickly. If this is the case with the Demon King, then perhaps he could have become the strongest demon at only a few hundred years old. Whatever the case may be, perhaps we will have an answer by the end of the story. Why do demons kill humans? At first glance, this may seem like a dumb question that already has an answer in the story. The answer being that it is an instinct that they develop via evolution in order to better hunt and kill humans for food. There is a lot of evidence that supports this, but there is a question that arises from this. If demons evolved to hunt and kill humans, then why is it they don't always eat them? Isn't that the whole point of hunting a specific prey in order to eat them? Frieren establishes that demons don't even need to eat humans. They can eat anything they want, which includes foods like fruits and vegetables, meaning they are omnivorous. One potential explanation for this would be to relate the demons in Frieren to an animal like a cat. A cat will often play with and kill rodents and other prey instinctually, and sometimes won't eat them. Some theorize the reason they have this instinctual prey drive that causes this behavior is because it serves as a form of practice. Perhaps demons are the same. Demons could simply be killing humans without eating them as a form of practice in order to get even better at killing them in the future. This idea is actually supported in the story by Genau, who states that the demons who create blades kill a lot of people. The deaths are not necessary. They do it to test their blades. Another question that arises concerning demons is the idea that if demons are omnivorous, then why is it they evolved to hunt humanity as opposed to easier options such as any other animal, or even just seek out fruits and vegetables? In nature, predators will typically take the path of least resistance and will hunt prey that is the easiest option available to them. There are some real-life exceptions to this, such as orcas who hunt different animals depending on what their specific pod hunts. However, this is a learned behavior, not an instinctual one. Demons within Frieren specialized in hunting humanity, despite the fact that humanity is slowly wiping them all out. This seems somewhat counterintuitive in that the risk to reward ratio is just not worth it when it comes to hunting humans, which is probably why demons are slowly getting wiped out. The answer to this question could simply be that humans used to be easy prey for demonkind for many thousands of years. Really, it wasn't until humans started learning magic under Flamma that humanity was able to start fighting back against the demons. It could be that demons simply didn't have the time to evolutionarily adapt to this new change within humanity, which resulted in their decline. Tier 2. Funny Serie Face. Ewig the Sage. Ewig the Sage was a powerful human mage from the Mythical Era that is mentioned in passing a few times within the story. The first was when Frieren was deciphering Heiter's grimoire, which was supposedly created by Ewig and was believed to hold the secrets to immortality. Of course, we know that the grimoire held no such knowledge, and it is unclear if the grimoire was even Ewig's to begin with. The second time Ewig is mentioned is during the first class mage exam arc in the ruin of the king's tomb. Genau states that the Watermere demon, known as the Spiegel, was mentioned within Ewig's heroic tales. As far as I know, nothing else is stated concerning what Ewig's heroic tales contain other than this small snippet of information. Ewig is last mentioned within the story during the Golden Lands arc, where it is revealed that he was able to create the stone bracelet of servitude that utilizes hypnosis magic so powerful that it is even able to control demons. This is basically all the information we have concerning Ewig, which introduces a few questions. If Ewig is a mage from the Mythical Era and is a human, then how does he even know magic at all? Within the story, we are led to believe that humanity not only did not use magic at this point in time, but also had a taboo against magic that was later broken by Flamma approximately 1,000 years ago. So if humanity didn't use magic during the Mythical Era, then how did Ewig know it? One solution could be that he trained under an elf, similar to how Flamma trained under Serie. I don't believe it was Serie herself who trained him, else she would have mentioned him at some point throughout the story, as one of her greatest disciples, which we don't observe at all. This is complete speculation, of course, but perhaps Ewig's existence and greatness, despite being human, may have later influenced Serie to have her own human apprentice Flamma. Monsters and their deaths. Have you ever noticed that when some monsters die within Frieren, their body dissipates into what appears to be mana particles? We see that demons and dragons do this along with other monsters they encounter, such as wolf creatures, mimics, etc. Yet other creatures such as humanity, as well as regular animals, leave a carcass behind. Even now, it is not clear why this is the case. We even observe monster parts such as the shadow dragon horn being preserved, despite the fact that the monster it belonged to is likely long dead. Does this mean if you cut off a monster part before they die, you can preserve it, or does it need to be shed naturally by the creature?
I don't know.
Again, this is not made clear at all within the story. It actually makes me wonder if all the creatures that turn to particles when they die are from a different evolutionary source from the creatures that leave a body behind. For example, if the goddess of creation created humanity and all the animals, then could it be that something else created all the monsters and demons that turn into particles? I'm probably way overthinking this, and it's just a homage to Japanese RPGs, where monster bodies disappear when they are killed. Either way, it's an interesting thought experiment. What was Frieren trying to summon? Remember that shadow dragon horn that I just talked about? Well, when Frieren goes to retrieve the horn from Himmel, she states that she needs it for summoning. So what the heck was she trying to summon, and what happened to the horn? When I hear the word summoning in a fantasy setting, I think of summoning either a creature or some kind of inanimate object. Within the world of Frieren, we don't really see summoning magic used, if at all. We know that Frieren herself is able to make her staff appear and disappear at will, but this doesn't seem to be related with the horn at all. We occasionally see a blue bird delivering messages, but it's unclear if this is some kind of summon or just a trained bird. We also know that Genau is able to use bird controlling magic, which doesn't appear to be a summon as well, which seems to suggest that the blue bird could just be a bird controlled with magic, but I digress. Whatever she is trying to summon shall remain
one of nature's mysteries.
Demon Hierarchy. Alright, we know from Flamma that demons base their entire society, if you can call it that, on a hierarchy of power. In other words, the strong rules and the weak obeys. Kinda like Andrew Ryan's famous quote.
A man chooses. A slave obeys.
Except the man would be the Demon King, and the slaves would be every other demon. Flamma even explains that demons use their mana as an indicator of their power, in other words, like a status symbol. Although the hierarchy of power idea holds true for the most part, due to the individualistic nature of the demons, ordering them around is kind of like trying to herd cats. A good example would be when the Demon King assembled his sages of destruction to kill the hero of the South. We observe the greater demon mocked, being forced to join this expedition despite him not wanting to do so. Schlock the Omniscient even foresaw that Mocked would try to disobey, and brought Growsome the Miraculous to force his hand. Another time we witness similar behavior is when the Demon King sent out his forces to investigate Frieren being sent back in time. We observe the demon Tot, Saint of the End, straight up refused to assist, and Solitaire only agreed to assist in a hidden supported position. That's not to say that every demon is a selfish prick. When Qual, Elder Sage of Corruption, was freed from his seal by Frieren, he stated that he would avenge the Demon King. Solitaire even went out of her way to free and help Mock, despite it essentially costing her life, even though she previously made it clear that she didn't want to risk her own skin. That story is a bit more complicated, but like I said previously, demons seem to behave individualistically according to their own desires, unless forced otherwise by a more powerful demon. If we were to actually rank the hierarchy of demons, I believe it would look something like the following. At the very top, we would have the Demon King, which goes without saying. Below him would be Schlock the Omniscient, who was directly stated to be the Demon King's right-hand man. Below Schlock would be all the Sages of Destruction, along with the greater demons. It could be argued that the true third in command of all the Demon King's forces was actually Qual, Elder Sage of Corruption. A hint to this could simply be in his title of Elder Sage of Corruption. Not only is he given the honorific of Elder, but is given the unique title of Sage of Corruption, which of course is unique from the Sages of Destruction. We also know that in terms of strength, he was nearly unmatched in his era, where even the hero party could not defeat him and had to seal him away. However, this is mostly speculation, and so I'll place him with the other greater demons. Looking at the 7 Sages of Destruction, we have Aura the Guillotine, who needs no introduction. Bose the Immortal, who was slain by the hero party, as well as Growsome the Miraculous. Mocked at the Golden Land was later handled by Frieren, and the 3 unnamed sages were defeated by the hero of the South. The other greater demons would include Qual and Solitaire, who were slain by Frieren and Fern, with only Tot, Saint of the End, and Ravala, the bloody god of war, who are still alive. Sub-demon classifications. This one is going to be a quick one, but this is basically the concept that there are different types of demons within the world of Frieren. We all know about the regular demons, such as all the Sages of Destruction, who are humanoid in shape and are mages. However, there are other demon species mentioned, such as the Einsam, that Fern and Frieren fought in the forest. You might think that the Spiegel, the water mirror demon, is also a unique demon species. I initially thought this was a contradiction from how Flamma defined demons as monsters that use the power of words, and we already know that the Spiegel doesn't talk, but apparently the kanji for demon that it uses is different from the other demons, thus making it just a monster. I never would have known this if not for the Frieren wiki, so kudos to the wiki writers. We also know that demons can specialize into warriors instead of mages, the strongest of which are known as demon generals. We know that a demon's appearance, including their clothes, is literally a part of their body. We can assume this from the fact that a demon's clothes disappear into mana particles when they die, along with the rest of their body. What isn't clear to me, however, is how much control does a demon have over the rest of their appearance, such as their body shape or face. Demons such as Qual and the Divine Revolt look nothing like a conventional demon, and that nobody could confuse them for a regular human. Does this mean that a demon is able to change their physical appearance and body structures to better suit their desires, or are they actually born with this appearance in mind? Whatever the answer is, I believe it's clear that they don't change their physical appearance after the fact. When Growsome is introduced into the story, Solitaire mentions that he is able to change his face at will, which strongly implies that other demons cannot do this, else why would she mention this at all? This to me implies that each of these demons are likely born with the physical appearance that they have, and any changes they make to themselves are restricted to clothing and equipment. Although to be honest, we don't ever see a demon change the appearance of their clothes as far as I know. I assume they can, because it doesn't make much sense for them to know what clothes would look like if they were just born. Demon origins. We talked a little about this, but it's a topic that needs further clarification. In the story itself, it is basically confirmed that demons evolved to hunt humans. We are also told that the goddess of creation created the world, which implies that she also created the demons, or at least she created some proto-version of a demon that later evolved into what we observe today.
Who's that Pokemon? It's
Aura the Guillotine.
During a previous entry, I speculated that perhaps it wasn't the goddess that created the demons and the monsters, but some other entity, due to the fact that they completely disintegrate into mana when they die, which is extremely different from the rest of humanity and the other animals. Of course, we probably won't ever know the true answer to this, but it's fun to speculate nevertheless. Tier 3. Deadpan Frieren. Kraft and the Priest. In an early chapter of the series, we learn that Kraft and a priest have a statue made in their likeness within a human village. Nobody in the town knows who they are other than that they were heroes. The existence of the priest and what appears to be the book of scriptures he is carrying dates the statue to at most 1500 years before the present day. If Kraft were to have gone on some heroic adventure, it probably would have taken place between 1500 to 1000 years ago, before the Demon King became well known and took power. It would explain why Frieren never heard of him before, because it would have been before she was born. Although to be fair, even Kraft didn't know of Frieren's existence, even though she killed the Demon King. Bro's been living under a rock, if you ask me. The Unified Eras. Okay, so this entry basically talks about a couple of the eras of the past that I've talked about already. One is known as the Unified Dynasty Era, and the other is the Unified Empire Era. Remember that king's tomb that the Spiegel was in? This tomb was said to have originated from the Unified Dynasty Era, but there is no known date associated with this. However, we see a wall mural of the Spiegel itself, as well as Ewig the Sage, who we know is from the Mythical Era. Of course, all this means is that the Unified Dynasty era came after the Mythical Era. The Unified Empire era I've talked about a bit previously, but just remember that it was when humanity ruled the majority of the continent, which also occurred after the Mythical, but before the time of Flamma, which would date this period to 1500 years ago at the latest and 1000 years ago at the earliest. Curses. What a curse is first described to us in chapter 31 by Frieren as magic that humanity doesn't understand that can influence them, such as by causing some status effect like petrification. We also learn here that mages are not able to sense curses, but priests can. We get a more descriptive definition of what a curse is in chapter 82. Curse is the general term for spells that change the state of living beings and matter. For example, spells that put the target to sleep or turn the target into stone. Interestingly, although curses are generally handled by priests, powerful curses such as the magic of Mocked of the Golden Land cannot be dispelled by them. Frieren herself was able to dispel Mock's Curse of Gold by analyzing the fundamental theory behind how his spell worked and reversing it. To me, this implies that most, if not all, curses can be dispelled by a mage if the fundamentals of the curse itself are well understood. This doesn't explain why the goddess's magic was unable to remove the curse, but we will talk more about the goddess's magic later. The Sword of the Hero. So this mystery is technically one of the bigger ones that was introduced into the story, but because everyone knows it in great detail, I put it in the middle of the iceberg. I've already talked about it extensively, so I'm basically going to plagiarize what I said before. We are told that the Sword of the Hero was bestowed upon humanity by the goddess and was embedded within the earth. No hero in history has been able to remove it, which includes Himmel himself. We also know that the sword does contain some kind of power, as it is able to attract monsters who desire to destroy the sword, which of course implies that the sword is not fake, in the sense that it is a powerful sword. If we assume that it was the goddess who planted the sword there, then I'm going to assume she did it for a reason. This would mean that at some point in the future, there will be a hero who is going to wield the sword to probably save the world from some calamity. Else the whole purpose of the sword would be pointless. I understand from a narrative point of view, the sword was utilized as a plot device to emphasize the heroism of Himmel. In other words, to show that you can be a hero without having the sword of the hero. Some people predict that it is Stark who is going to be the one to wield the sword, but I personally disagree with this theory. I've mentioned this before, but if Stark was going to wield the sword, then he would have done so when he arrived at the Village of the Sword. Purely from a logistical perspective, it doesn't make sense for them to progress to the northernmost part of the continent, only to backtrack to collect a sword that they already passed. Not only this, but the anime places emphasis between Stark and the sword that does not exist in the manga. And lastly, Stark's master Aizen uses an axe, not a sword. Although he was trained in the sword when he was a kid, ultimately it makes more sense for him to continue using the same weapon type that his master used. Personally, I believe that the sword will be utilized in the final war that will occur between humanity and demonkind that Schlock predicted would occur in 1,000 years. I doubt we will ever see the conclusion of this particular plot thread, but still it's interesting to discuss. I'll talk about this potential conflict deeper into the iceberg. Divine Cleaving Swords. When Stark and Ganao are talking about the demon known as the Divine Revolt, Ganao mentions that his magical blades and his name are based off a sword from mythical times that smashed apart a mountain. Other than this information, all the details concerning this original mythical divine blade are unknown. Did it belong to humanity, or was it of demon origin? Was it able to be both light as a feather and heavy like a boulder, similar to the divine cleaving swords that Revolt created? I somehow doubt we will ever get a true answer to these questions. Heirloom Sword of the Dach family. Yeah, you can tell I just grouped the swords together because I didn't know where else to put them. However, I do think this sword is a bit more interesting. Frieren herself says the following concerning the sword. The Dach family sword belonged to a prominent demon. It must have some appeal only demons can understand. This statement by Frieren introduces some questions. The first is, what appeal exactly does this sword hold to demons? We previously talked about how demons order their society on a hierarchy of power. Perhaps similar to how demon mages show off their mana, perhaps demon warriors or demon generals show off their own power and thus influenced by wielding powerful artifacts. So demons may be attracted to this artifact, similar to how a human uses clothing to show off their power and influence. The next question I have is, who did the sword belong to, and how do demons keep finding it? The first part of this question is unanswerable without more information. How Frieren even knows that the sword belonged to a prominent demon is unclear. The fact that demons are able to keep finding the blade is strange in and of itself. Is the blade emitting some kind of energy that demons can sense, similar to how the Shadow Dragon horn emits a dark energy? I don't think so. We don't ever see the blade covered in any kind of energy, nor do we see Frieren track the blade using any energy it emits. To me, this implies the demons actively investigated and asked humans questions to find the blade's whereabouts. If this is the case, then how is it these demons even know that the blade belonged to a prominent demon to begin with? This would imply that the demons keep a history of these facts that is widely known throughout demonkind, else there would be no point in even seeking the blade out to begin with. Considering we don't see demons ever write historical records, although some are capable of reading, to me implies that this is knowledge that is spread among demons by word of mouth, which is an interesting idea in and of itself. Purpose of dungeons. If you think about it for a bit, the purpose of dungeons within the world of Frieren is not entirely clear. We don't ever see demons create anything other than their own magic. They don't seem to build houses or dungeons, so I'm going to assume they have little to do with the majority of dungeons within Frieren. The only dungeon we really get to see explored in detail would be the ruins of the King's Tomb that we see during the First Class Mage Exam arc. This means that this particular dungeon is a man-made dungeon likely made with the express purpose of protecting the body of the king and his treasures from looters. Does this mean that all dungeons are just ancient ruins created by humanity to defend something with the use of traps and monsters? Or perhaps monsters started occupying these ruins after they became deserted? This seems like the most reasonable explanation for the existence of dungeons, but it is still not 100% clear. Hell Emperor Dragon and the Thousand Mirror Tower. When Werble is speaking with Frieren, he mentions multiple famous stories of the hero party, such as the conquest of the Thousand Mirror Tower, the battles with Bose the Immortal, and the Hell Emperor Dragon. We already know about Frieren's battle with Bose the Immortal, but what about the other two? Well, I actually did not know this before I did research on this topic, but we actually get to see a Hell Emperor Dragon within the story. Later on during the Stone Monument arc, when Frieren time travels to the past, she, along with the hero party, encounters a dragon that is translated in English as the Abyssal Dragon. If you look at the Japanese source material, you can see that this is in fact a Hell Emperor Dragon, the same species that Werble talked about. Its appearance is a bit different than the one we saw from Werble, but the shape of its horns is the same. Of course, it's probably not the same dragon that inspired the story Werble is talking about, because that would create some kind of time paradox, but it's still interesting we get to see one at all. In my opinion, the biggest mystery of all has to do with the Thousand Mirror Tower. Initially, I assumed that the Thousand Mirror Tower was the base of Bose the Immortal. However, in retrospect, I believe all the hero party journeys that Werble mentioned are separate from one another. Now that we know for certain that Hell Emperor Dragon and Bose the Immortal refer to separate journeys, it only makes sense for the Thousand Mirror Tower to be unique as well. Additionally, I went back and viewed all the panels Bose appears in, and none of the backgrounds match the aesthetics of the tower, nor do his barriers act as mirrors. Until more information can be revealed about this mysterious tower, this shall remain
one of nature's mysteries.
Tier 4, Frieren Crying Tear. The Blessing of the Goddess. The Blessing of the Goddess is supposedly a blessing given to talented priests by the goddess, which allows them to resist curses. We've only ever seen two people exhibit the effects of this blessing, which would be Heiter and Sign. Sign was able to completely resist the sleeping curse of the Confusion Flower, while Heiter was able to resist Grausum the Miraculous's illusion magic of Ansel Hilchella, which was able to put both Frieren and Himmel into an illusion. In fact, Grausum straight up mentions that he is the first priest to ever resist his curse, which likely means this blessing is extremely rare among priests. So the question I have relating to this blessing is, does it actually come from the goddess herself, or is it just some kind of biological trait that some people have as a result of evolution? Well, only Sign has a living biological family member that we know of, which is his brother, who does not have the same blessing that Sign has. It's not a guarantee, of course, but to me this is an indicator that this isn't some kind of inheritable biological trait, but is probably an actual blessing given by the goddess, which brings up a different question of why does she bless some people and not others? We know that from a young age, Heiter was already a devout follower of the goddess, and likely already had her blessing at this point in time. It's unclear if the blessing is given at birth or at some later time frame after they show devotion to the goddess. Either way, it's clear that devoutness to the goddess isn't the sole prerequisite to receiving the blessing, as many devout priests don't have it. I personally believe that the people chosen by the goddess to receive the blessing have an important role to play in defending humanity. Remember that if Heiter did not have the blessing, then the hero party likely would have died to Grausum, and they never would have defeated the Demon King. Yes, Himmel was also able to use his instincts to fight Grausum, but it took him a while to figure it out, and Heiter was defending him during this process. Sign, on the other hand, was able to help Frieren's party and save that village from the Confusion Flower because of his blessing. In other words, the goddess gives her blessing to people who are not only devout, but are going to make an effective use of her blessing. If the goddess is omniscient like she is described in the story, then she probably already knows ahead of time who these people are going to be, hence she is able to give the blessing out at a young age. What happened to the Sages of Destruction? Okay, this isn't really a mystery per se, but it is somewhat obscure if you aren't keeping track. I also technically already talked about it in the Demon Hierarchy section, but I'll go into more detail here. Everyone knows what happened to Aura, but I should note that although she is the first Sage of Destruction introduced in the story, she was actually the second to last Sage of Destruction to die within the story. The first 3 sages to die within the story died fighting against the hero of the South. We don't know their names, but we can actually see them in the paneling here. 2 appear to be women, while the latter appears to be a man, but of course it's difficult to say for sure. We don't know for sure who died next, but I believe it was likely Bose the Immortal. Evidence for this is that during the Frieren time travel arc, when the Demon King assembles his demons to take on the hero party, we don't see Bose, meaning he is probably already dead at this point in time. To be fair, we also don't see Aura, but that is probably because she went into hiding after she got her butt whooped.
I have crippling depression.
We do see that Grausum the Miraculous is still alive, which of course is why I believe he died after Bose. So the hero party must have encountered Bose the Immortal during their journey to defeat the Demon King. Bose was capable of creating barriers so strong they broke Frieren's spirit. Himmel gave her a pep talk, however, and the party was able to whittle down the barrier and ultimately take him down. The next to die by the hero party would have been Grausum the Miraculous, who would have been the 5th sage to die. His death is extremely mysterious, and there is a theory specifically concerning it that I will talk about deeper into the Iceberg. The 6th we've talked about already, being Aura, while the last sage would be Mock of the Golden Land. His story is a very long one that will be covered in detail when Season 3 of the anime comes out, but for now just know that he is the strongest Sage of Destruction and was imprisoned in a barrier similar to how Qual was imprisoned by the hero party. The 11 mages that defeated Frieren. This is a topic that I have previously spoken of at length. I even created a little flowchart back in the day that I shall reveal before you all again here with a brief re-explanation. Frieren mentions in the first class exam arc that she has been defeated 11 times in her life by people with less mana than her. 4 were by demons, 1 was by elf, and 6 were by humans. The flowchart I show here reveals some of the potential candidates for each race. The clearest category to answer by far are the demons, simply because we have the most information here compared to the other categories. Qual, the Sage of Corruption, is the obvious first choice, as he was directly confronted by the hero party and was so powerful he had to be sealed away to be dealt with at a later date. Fern straight up asked Frieren if Qual was one of them, which she basically confirms. The next candidate is also obvious, as it is revealed to us in the manga that Frieren had an encounter with the Sage of Destruction mocked, who clapped her cheek so hard she completely gave up on fighting demons and essentially became a hermit that lived in the forest for 500 years. Of course this changed when Himmel convinced her otherwise, but Mocked basically gave her PTSD. Oh, and she straight up says that she lost to him. The third demon that I believe defeated Frieren would be the Sage of Destruction, Bose the Immortal. Although technically the hero party would ultimately defeat Bose in their battle, Frieren herself had her spirit and will completely broken by him. When she was trapped in his barrier, she essentially gave up, and it was the words and actions of Himmel and the rest of the hero party which convinced her to keep moving forward. In other words, without the help of the hero party, she likely would have died, and so I'm considering this an L on her part. The fourth demon to me is a choice between the Demon King and Growsome the Miraculous. The Demon King may seem like a logical choice in the sense that Frieren could not have defeated him alone. However, I don't believe he is a good candidate, as I consider it highly likely that the Demon King had more mana than Frieren, as he was not only older than her, which we know is an important attribute of mana accumulation, but was literally the strongest of his entire race while he lived. On the other hand, Growsome was able to trap Frieren in an illusion that she was not able to escape from alone during the time traveling arc, which could definitely be considered an L. However, this technically didn't occur, at least according to her knowledge at this point in the story. It's possible a similar incident happened when they encountered Growsome in her original past, uninfluenced by time travel, but that's speculation. However, I still think it to be the likeliest option. If we swap to the elf category, finding the singular elf who defeated her is somewhat challenging. The first contender that comes to mind would be Serie. Although Serie definitely has the capability to take Frieren down, we have already witnessed every single encounter Frieren has had with Serie, and they never fought each other, not even for training purposes. Also, it's very clear that Serie has way more mana than Frieren, which directly goes against the condition of the contenders having less mana than her. All the other named elves don't really apply either. She first met Kraft when she was with Fern, and the elf Milliard dedicated her life to the development of her alcohol known as Bowshaft, and so was probably not a powerful mage. The only character that is named in the story that I think may have encountered and defeated Frieren would be Minus the Witch. There are multiple reasons I believe this to be the case. Frieren herself mentions that the elf who defeated her was an elf just like her. We know that just like Frieren herself, Minus the Witch was considered a great mage before she was killed. Not only this, but we know that Minus had used her magic against humanity and killed people, which could potentially have given Frieren motive to have conflict with her. Of course, the incident I'm referring to would have occurred long after their fight would have taken place. However, if Minus had conflict with humans after the incident, then I find it likely she had conflict with humanity before the incident as well. In fact, the Empire straight up claims that she was assassinated because she had started wars. So not only is there a potential motive, but she matches the criteria Frieren has set herself, which leads me to believe that she is the elf who defeated Frieren. The category of humans who defeated Frieren is where everything falls apart. Flamma is the first candidate in the sense that she was stronger than Frieren and likely sparred with and defeated her. However, Flamma doesn't really meet the requirements, as it's basically confirmed that she had more mana than Frieren at this point in the story. You could make the argument that Frieren had more mana than Flamma after training for 1,000 years. However, I believe this goes against the spirit of what Frieren said. Remember, she claimed that the individuals had less mana than her, which implies at the time of their battle, not relative to her mana level in the current day. For the next candidate, I only put Ewig the Sage in order to quickly dismiss him. As we established previously, he is a human from the Mythical Era and would not have encountered Frieren because there is a 500-year gap of separation between them. Frase, captain of the Magic Special Forces, is definitely a human mage that is strong enough to have given Frieren a run for her money, considering that not only is she the leader of a unit that specializes in hunting down other mages, but Mach, the strongest sage of destruction, described her as being powerful enough to destroy the fortress city of Weiss, and requested permission to kill her, which he never before asked of his master Lord Gluck. This occurred 50 years before the current events of the story. Coincidentally, we also know that 50 years ago, the Empire put a secret bounty on Frieren's head, which could provide a potential motive for a conflict between the two. However, the timeline of events doesn't seem to support this theory. In order for the two to have met, then it would have occurred after Frieren had already gone on her adventure with the hero party, specifically when she was traveling around, and we don't see any interaction between the two. Additionally, in order for them to have interacted, Frase would have had to go very deep into the south and would have had to search for years to have even come close to finding her. It seems logistically unlikely for this series of events to have occurred. Concerning the other humans who defeated Frieren, they are unknown to me. However, in another video I made concerning this mystery, a commenter mentioned that these humans likely would have defeated Frieren while she was still in training with Flamma. It's quite possible that Flamma would have taken on other students in preparation for making the kingdom proficient in magic, and it seems probable to me that some of these other students could have defeated Frieren at this point in time, as it was when Frieren was the youngest, and thus would have been easiest to defeat, at least relative to how strong she is in the modern day. Frieren even mentions herself that some of the Empire's mages were stronger than her, which further supports this theory. The Mythical Era. I've spoken quite a bit about this era already, but I'm going to explain it in more complete detail here. The Mythical Era is the oldest era that is recorded by humanity and essentially extends for 1500 years before the current events of the story to essentially the beginning of time. To be even more accurate, this would have been approximately 1584 years before the present day, as the 1500-year statement comes from Heiter when Himmel was 23 years old. Because Himmel died when he was 76, and given that the current story takes place 31 years after his death, then this dates the initial estimation by 84 years, hence the 1584 year mark. The initial statement made by Heiter is actually referring to the approximate year the goddess of creation was said to have given humanity her holy scriptures. Hi y'all, this is me from the future. I just wanted to make a clarification. While I was gathering panels for the video, it shocked me to discover that the Viz translation changed the meaning of Heiter's claim to be generic, with the words, "in the 1500 years since this world was blessed with the holy scriptures of the goddess." On the other hand, the Kira Cake translation explicitly states that the scriptures were brought to the world by the goddess. So which translation is more accurate to the source material? If we look at the original Japanese, we can see that the words seem to more closely align with the Kira Cake translation, with the line Megami-sama ni yotte, which explicitly states by the goddess. I don't speak Japanese, so feel free to tell me in the comments which version is more accurate. Alright, future me out. Peace. Which is what dates the Mythical Era to this year. Of course, this doesn't mean that this era doesn't extend further than is stated here. It's quite possible that the Mythical Era ended hundreds of years after this date. However, it likely wasn't much longer after this date, as there needs to be at least a few hundred-year gap to account for the unified eras. We also know that Flamma's era started 1,000 years ago, which sandwiches the unified eras between hers and the Mythical Era. So, what's so special about this era anyway, you may be wondering? Well, as we've just discussed before, the last time the goddess of creation interacted directly with humanity was during this era. She supposedly gave humanity the Holy Scriptures, her 10 goddess monuments, and also would have given humanity the Sword of the Hero. Ewig the Sage is also from this era, and he created grimoires as well as the Bracelet of Servitude, which could even work on demons. Serie also comes from this era. In short, a bunch of fantastical things happen within the Mythical Era. Serie's fate. I covered this extensively in my last video, and I suspect this will not remain a mystery for long, but to keep things short, the current arc contains a plotline concerning the assassination of Serie by the Shadow Organization that takes place within the Empire. Serie utilizes a form of future sight magic that allows her to see her own death due to the assassination, and despite her great efforts is unable to change her fate alone. This is because her assassin not only is powerful, but is also using future sight magic as well. Despite this, she hasn't given up and has enlisted the help of a multitude of wildcard mages, which includes Frieren and Fern to assist her. So this mystery is essentially whether Serie will live or die in the current arc of the story. I personally believe she will survive due to the wildcard mages she has assembled, as well as how notoriously unreliable future sight magic is, especially the version of it Serie has. The last reason is that Frieren isn't the type of story where good aligned main characters get their heads decapitated on screen. Yeah, I just don't think it's that type of story. Shadow Warrior Frieren Assassination. While Frieren is traveling northward towards the Empire, she encounters an old man named Radar, who lets them stay within his village for free. We later learn that Radar is a Shadow Warrior who many years ago was sent on a mission to assassinate people who were on a list. He, along with many others, were stationed at the village, which served as a major choke point from the south leading into the imperial capital. Radar stayed in the village so long that every other member that went with him passed away, leaving him as the last. One thing leads to another, and he attempts to assassinate Frieren in the dark of the night.
Revenge will be sweet when the curse is complete. In the dark of the night, she'll be gone!
But is ultimately foiled due to the help of Stark and Fern. Frieren basically tells the man that no one remembers the mission and to live his life in peace, which he ultimately does. All of which leads us to the question of why. Why did the Shadow Warrior organization want Frieren to be assassinated? Well, when Radar was issued the mission, one of his companions mentioned that many individuals on the list had contributed to the Empire, which would imply that they were all people who were well known enough to be recognized by him. Later on, during the Foundation Festival arc, a Shadow Warrior named Walros claims to have seen Frieren on an old list that fell through. He clarifies that it was during a time of turmoil over the successor of the previous emperor and that many commanders were overthrown and active plans were vaporized, which basically confirms that Frieren was right and the mission that Radar was on was essentially forgotten. All of which still doesn't give us any concrete answers though. Well, in the same arc, we learn that the Shadow Warrior organization was formally disbanded by the Emperor, essentially because he couldn't control them. They worked from the shadows and were able to carry out tasks without supervision or a higher authority according to their own agenda. So why is the formal disbandment of the Shadow Warriors important? I believe this tells us that the individual who put a bounty on Frieren had nothing to do with the royal family. Considering everything we've learned, I find it likely that the individual who placed the bounty on Frieren was likely a cell commander within the Shadow Warrior organization. Like Walros claimed, this cell commander was probably overthrown and thus the bounty was forgotten about. They probably put Frieren on the list because they thought that she was a potential threat to the Empire. Perhaps they compared her to Minus the Witch, who was also an elf who is directly stated by the Shadow Warriors to have started wars, and thus was assassinated because of this. Does this mean that orders for assassinations were placed on all the great mages, Frieren, Minus, and Serie at the same time? Or did it happen piecemeal due to unrelated reasons? This is unclear to me, but maybe we will get an answer to this question one day. Why did Frase attack Lan's grandma? Okay, so I should probably explain the context of this question. I've previously spoken about Frase in passing, but to refresh your memory, she has been the captain of the Empire's Magic Special Forces for over 50 years. I previously mentioned that when Mocked of the Golden Land encountered her, he stated that she was extremely dangerous and requested permission from his master, Lord Luke, to kill her. Land, on the other hand, is the mage within the First Class Mage exam arc that didn't even show up in person and stayed home the entire time, sipping his tea. Or as Buzz Lightyear would say,
sucking down Darjeeling with
Marie Antoinette and her little sister.
Anyway, when Land became a first-class mage, he asked Serie for magic that could locate his family's remains. Be sure to keep this in mind for later. Within the current arc of the story, Ubil wanted to recruit Land for the mission to protect Serie, and he reveals to her that his grandmother passed away 5 years ago due to old age. Well, it's revealed later in the arc that his grandmother was attacked by Frase 5 years ago when Land was just a kid. I believe all of this information is enough to conclude that Land's initial claim that his grandmother passed of old age was likely a lie. I believe that Land's grandma was captured and later killed by Frase, which would explain why he asked Serie for the spell to locate his family's remains. One could make the argument that the spell was actually to locate the rest of his family members' bodies, such as his mother and father, who are likely dead as well, considering his grandmother raised him. However, I disagree with this notion, as he did not visit or mention any other graves when he left the village. He only mentioned his grandmother. Remember that by the time Land had received his indulgence from Serie, a decent amount of time had passed within the story up until the current arc. So this would mean that Land just sat on his ass not doing anything with the spells Serie had given him, which I don't believe to be the case. I find it more likely that he was actively using the spell to gather the remains of his grandmother, which he was successfully able to do. So of course we return to the question of why. Why did Frase attack Land's grandmother? When everyone is assembled in the Imperial capital, Serie tells Land that being in the Imperial capital must fill you with nostalgia. Your parents and grandmother... Then Land says, I don't want to talk about it. This exchange of words directly connects both Land, his parents, and his grandmother to the Imperial capital. I think it's pretty clear that the implication here is that both Land's parents and grandmother were considered enemies of the state and thus were assassinated. The fact that Serie knew them well enough to even talk about them with Land could mean that perhaps they served under her as first-class mages within the Continental Magic Association. This could explain the direct conflict between Land's grandmother and Frase, as she would have felt the need to intervene and deal with the big threat of a powerful first-class mage personally in order to protect the Empire. This next theory is a bit out there, but I hope you hear me out. What if Land's grandmother, as well as his parents, were either members of or associated with the Court of the Sacred Staff? You may be wondering what the heck is that, and I promise I'll go into more detail within the next tier, but in short, it's some kind of secret organization that is associated with the Empire. The reason I bring this up at all is because in the same chapter that the Court of the Sacred Staff is introduced into the story, literally 2 pages later, we see the conflict between Frase and Land's grandmother. This reminds me of the narrative device of Chekhov's gun. Why even mention the existence of the Court of the Sacred Staff if it wasn't going to be relevant to the plot at all? This secret organization is also associated with the Holy Emblem, and by proxy the Great Mages. This could also explain how and why Serie knew of Land's family, but until more information is revealed, this shall remain
one of nature's mysteries!
Alright, this video has gone on long enough, so I'll save the rest of the tiers for part 2 of this video. If you made it this far and liked what you saw, please like and subscribe for future content. Peace.